Thank you very much, Peter Spiegel, although I note you did run a little bit over length, for a very bracing panel. Both panels were indeed very bracing, the first on climate, the second on COVID. Bracing because we clearly haven't seen the kind of international cooperation over the pandemic that might presage a better cooperation over climate or indeed future pandemics. And that's really the sort of first takeaway I have from these two panels. And the second is, and we're going to get into both of these, but the second is that the gap between what the West pledges, whether it be on vaccine distribution or on climate finance, remains as wide as ever. And that's something that maybe a year ago we wouldn't have predicted, given some of the early expectations around global cooperation with this pandemic. So we're going to focus in this panel, this concluding panel, on solutions and finding common ground and how to fix this fractured world that the first two panels elucidated so well. And with me is a really wonderful panel. We have Elizabeth Cousens, who's of course the host of this event, the head of the UN Foundation. We have Nanjala Nyabola, and correct me, Nanjala, if I've mispronounced your last name, who is a Nairobi-based writer and activist, and very, very well qualified to give a developing world perspective on both of these big themes. And Ngaire Woods, head of the Blavatnik School of Government at Oxford and a chair of economic governance at Oxford University. So welcome to all three of you. Let me start, Elizabeth, with you and ask you, what is it that we have learned from some of the failures we've just been hearing over COVID? And we can get on to the sort of warp speed kind of successes later. But what have we learned from what's gone wrong in the last 18 months about how we can better tackle future pandemics and indeed global warming?
Well, thank you, Ed. It is delightful to be here with you and with Nanjala and Ngaire and to follow two such provocative panels. Let me step back just a minute. We are at a profound turning point. We have to decide whether we're prepared as societies, as a global community, to cooperate and in new ways to solve challenges like climate and like COVID that are right on our doorstep, or whether we don't. John and Kangasong made that point extremely clearly in the last panel. The biggest threats we face today, whether it's COVID or climate change, are transnational. A virus does not respect borders, neither do greenhouse gas emissions. You know, the rising assault on science that we all talk about that threatens every single one of our societies, that doesn't stop at borders either. So we are connected in our vulnerability to these kinds of threats, and we absolutely need reinvigorated cooperation to deal with them. So COVID-19 absolutely is the wake-up call everybody talks about. It's a test, and we aren't passing it yet. And we know there are even bigger tests to come, obviously, including climate change. I will say, I think there are bright spots. You know, there are bright spots in the leadership of cities and governors and businesses that are moving faster on things like climate than many governments. There are innovations in some of the international capacities we have to deal with global health threats, some of which came up in the last panel. And there is especially an incredibly powerful demand from so many quarters and rising impatience and even anger that the most powerful countries deliver on their promises, deliver on equity. And that, you know, is an opportunity for leadership that is before every leader in the world today. So, you know, to me, there's no alternative to cooperation in an interconnected world. Solidarity is self-interest, and that is very much the choice before us today.
So, I mean, very important, you know, point there, distinction between what you pledge and what you deliver. And I think that's most keenly felt in countries such as Kenya around the world. Nanjala, the same question to you. What has the last 18 months, and bearing in mind Elizabeth's remarks, what has the last 18 months taught you about how we can improve going forward?
I think one of the interesting things for me has been the inability to pay attention to the successes and to invest in the successes. I think one of the big tragedies that has really emerged has been that because of the concentration of resources, whether we're talking about vaccines, whether we're talking about public health professionals, research, etc., we're very attuned to paying attention to where things are going wrong. And that's good, and it's legitimate because we want to fix those things and want to address those things. But there are successes that have been happening in other parts of the world that have kind of gone under the radar, and failing to invest in them means that we compound the challenges that are coming down the pipeline. So one very quick example, and Dr. Nkengasong really has talked about this in multiple fora, has been the acceleration of access to testing capacity, access to just the raw materials of, the frontline materials of containing the virus, whether we're talking about testing, whether we're talking about tracking, whether we're talking about networks of information. In the African continent, we went from having zero testing capacity in January 2020 to every single country in Africa having testing capacity by the end of March. That's a tremendous acceleration in, raw materials and organization, in investment in infrastructure that happened over a 3-month period because of the kind of partnerships that we want to scale up, the kind of partnerships that we want, whether we're talking about the Africa Vaccine Acquisition Task Force, whether we're talking about the Africa CDC, whether we're talking about regional cooperation at the African Union level. Those are the kind of successes that we want to see rolled out in different ways around the world or scaled up in Africa. And so for me, it's from a cognitive perspective, from an ideational perspective, is wanting to see us be better at identifying successes, investing in successes, boosting their capacity, amplifying the work that's being done so that we're not just able to perceive what's going wrong, but also able to perceive what's going right and respond to it accordingly.
Ngaire, it strikes me from both of those opening statements that the gap that we're talking about between pledge and delivery is going to be exacerbated by what is maybe 5, 10, 15 years of fallback in development, of loss of Millennium Development Goals because of the economic hit to poorer countries from this pandemic. As you answer the same question that the first two have answered, could you incorporate that as a factor? Because we're not looking at the same numbers that we were looking at 18 months ago in terms of Millennium Development achievements in the developing world.
Yeah, I think that's really important. And something that I think people miss when we look at that lost generation, that's going to result from COVID, the number of kids who have been out of school for 2 years that don't have access to Wi-Fi, that don't have a Zoom classroom, even if a Zoom classroom were to work. The untreated diseases that are resulting as a cause of the focus on COVID. That does mean, as you say, Ed, that progress towards the Millennium Development Goals, the Sustainable Development Goals, has been really set back. I would want to add to that, to what you said, the fact that the United States, the United Kingdom, European countries have been the super spreaders of COVID. That there's a lot of attention now to what it is that poor countries need to do. And there's a lot of attention about what international organizations need to do. But some work that we've done here at Oxford at the Blavatnik School shows that actually the infections in New York did not come from China. They actually came from Europe. That the measures that countries that have so many flights coming in and out of took immediately when the virus began, their failure to control people leaving their countries with virus meant that the virus spread very, very quickly. And I think there is a responsibility on those wealthy countries that are so hyper-connected, that were the super spreaders of COVID, to take responsibility for that, not to do it next time, and to accept that their failure to slow the spread of the disease hugely increased the burden on poorest countries. So there's an additional responsibility there. But I think there's two other failures that I think are worth pondering on, because they're real opportunities for improvement. And one is that even in the wealthiest countries, there was what COVID showed us was that there is not enough connective tissue between London and the different devolved governments and local governments of Britain, between Washington, DC and the different states of the United States, between Delhi and the rest of the country, that there was almost no capacity in a crisis for them to share information, to share resources, and to share decisions. And if you can't do that on something that requires so much local action, you cannot govern. You can't even govern within your own country, let alone cooperate with others. And I think that's important for us to learn, not just for the next pandemic, but also for climate change, that we've got to build connective tissue within our own countries. And then I guess the other surprising thing is that COVID has created phase after phase of uncertainty. And countries have, in my view, been almost unable to learn from other countries in a timely, immediate way. We launched this Oxford Government Response Tracker at the school. And what that tells us, as it tracks every government's response to each phase of COVID, is that governments tend rather blindly to follow other governments that they have some reason to admire, instead of asking, hold on, who's getting this phase of the crisis right? What are they doing? How do we actually mimic them? That there's a reluctance on the part of Europeans to say we should be doing what China's doing, and instead a desire to look at their neighbors and say, well, let's just copy our neighbor, even when that's not working. So I think a real opportunity to learn much faster from people succeeding if we face an uncertain crisis, and a real need for those who spread the crisis so quickly to take additional responsibility for the additional burden they've put on some of the poorest countries of the world.
That's a very interesting point, and particularly the last point you just reiterated, which is, I think, the first you made. The analogy there that strikes me is between the West being super spreaders of this, and therefore bearing a huge responsibility for its impact in the developing world, and the stock of carbon that's out there, which is predominantly hitherto come from the West, perhaps not going forward. Let's just sort of get to more of the solutions, because when you confront topics like this, you can talk yourself, up to a suicidal ledge, and there are solutions. Multilateralism. Donald Rumsfeld, the late Donald Rumsfeld, once notoriously said, you go to war with the army you have. Well, we've got the multilateralism we have. How can we reimagine it, Elizabeth? How can we improve it? I believe UN Secretary General Guterres is, with his common agenda, trying to reimagine multilateralism, and I know you've been part of that conversation. How would that look?
Well, great question, and I'll come to it, but I actually want to follow up first on Nanjala's point before, because we've done some recent modeling. It very much follows also on John and Kangasong's point about prior investments that have been made in global health over the last 20 years and how that's impacted COVID response today. And the modeling shows that all of the different investments that have been made in the global health field over the last 20 years, some of them around the MDGs that you mentioned, some of them after, a whole range of innovations. Had it not been for those, if COVID had happened in the year 2000, instead of in 2020, the total death toll would have been 2 to 3 times higher. Global GDP losses would have been $3 trillion higher, and even very modest additional delays in detection, diagnostics, disease control, and above all, vaccine development, which we've been talking about, would have made the pandemic even more devastating. So I mention all of that just to say there have been actually important advances. Some of them are at great risk of backsliding, as you've talked about, with respect to development gains as well, but important investments and advances that it's worth remembering when we think about a future that looks very stark and a bit frightening, because that's part of what we need to draw on. So you asked about the Secretary General's thinking about the future of multilateralism. He's been talking for some time, as have been many academics and activists around the world, about the need for multilateralism to be stronger, but to change. And it needs to change in particular to be more networked and inclusive. So that relates to some of the conversation we were having before about regional solutions. A networked multilateralism doesn't have the UN doing everything from the top down. It has the UN doing things that make sense for the UN, but working very much in collaborative partnership with different nodes of expertise, capacity, leadership in different parts of the world and in different sectors. That's enormously important, not only because that's where the capabilities are and that's where people should be able to design the solutions that make sense for them, but also it builds resilience. We all know that networks, are either fragile or they're resilient, and that's a lot of what we need in the world today. So he has a very bold vision in this Common Agenda report. Uniquely, he asked a group of young people to work with their counterparts around the world and produce a shadow report. It's called Our Future Agenda. It's really powerful. They're both great reads together. I really recommend that people read them. You won't agree with everything, and I suspect on this panel we'd have a good debate about how we feel about the different proposals in them, but it's a really ambitious agenda. It's a very urgent agenda, and it recognizes exactly what we've been talking about for the last 2 hours, which is that the single greatest test before all of us is whether we can rise above our differences, our inertias, our limitations, and realize that we face common threats that we absolutely depend on each other to solve. There is no alternative to that. And climate and COVID are just the absolutely perfect exemplars of that, but they're not unique, frankly. So that is the challenge before us. And I think, to figure out more imaginative ways of conducting the business of finding common interest. We're not all going to like each other when we do that, but we do have interests in common that we need to find a way to work together on, because otherwise, the future does look very bleak. But I think there's the prospect of the alternative.
Can I just press you, Elizabeth, for 1 or 2 specifics on what that reimagining multilateralism looks like? Because, clearly if we've learned anything about multilateralism over the last year, it's that if the US and China don't agree with each other, very, very little can get done. How do you get around that?
Well, I think it's a number of different pieces, and there are a lot of proposals in this report, so I can't begin to summarize all of them, but it includes creating platforms for different nodes of leadership, for other countries to lead, for different institutions to show, have greater leadership. It includes building in very different capabilities for shared strategic analysis, foresight analysis, and planning for different future trends. Those are some of the issues that Ngaire was just speaking about. It includes really strenuous proposals for how to think differently about accountability. Some of the questions that have been coming up about promises made and not delivered. Includes a lot of ideas about how to build greater equity into not just international systems, but national systems as the kind of core basis for renewing trust between people and their governments, which we all know is at a very low ebb in most places around the world. So, and I don't think it's starry-eyed about the geostrategic challenges and tensions that can create incredible limits on the ability of others to cooperate. It sort of names it and then poses a challenge for us to try to find creative ways of working around and within that.
So, Nanjala, I saw you shaking your head as I mentioned,
Yeah.
when the US and China don't agree, then cooperation's hard. And I think that head shaking was fully deserved. I'm very conscious of the fact that perspectives such as yours and perspectives from other countries are overlooked. And that you in your first answer gave a wonderful example of how Africa did achieve something pretty early into the pandemic that might not have been predicted. Elizabeth just mentioned what the health improvements in our systems since 2000 have done to lessen this pandemic from something that would have been even more horrific. Can you give some examples from where you're sitting as to how to reimagine multilateralism?
Yeah, and I'm going to put something on the table that I think makes a lot of people very uncomfortable, but I think it's really urgent and important. I think that the future of multilateralism lies in decentering the West and decentering China. I think that there are more countries in the world that have interests that are not necessarily, and this is a very Bandung sort of approach to let's find a third way. Because I think the assumption, for example, and I think Ngaire pointed to this, that the West knew what it was doing, or Europe especially knew what it was doing when it came to COVID, is part of the reason why so many African countries are now in a mess. Keeping the borders open because the UK asked them to, keeping tourism going because European countries asked them to, and now we have a situation where we are not only facing this deadly virus and disease, but we're facing it without the support of the countries that asked us to keep the borders open, that asked us to keep these population circulations going. And so I really do think that we need a Bandung conference approach to this for the rest of the world, because we have to survive. And if we keep our survival contingent on what China is doing and what the West is doing and what China is fighting about and what the West is fighting about, we're not going to survive. That's the uncomfortable truth. Look at Afghanistan. You know, the idea that the solutions must come from the countries that have economic power, I think this pandemic has shown us that is deeply flawed. I think that African countries have been a standout success when it comes to regional coordination during this pandemic. I think at the national level, there are so many flaws that are happening, and you know, Kenya is a great example of how national policy fails to implement ideas that have been developed by policymakers, practitioners working at a regional level who don't have that domestic biases and the domestic sort of, they're not hamstrung domestically the way the domestic policymakers are. The success of the Africa CDC is born out of the 2014 Ebola outbreak. It was a realization that there was no pandemic level sort of predictive capacity, coordination capacity on the continent. And so the fact that the Africa CDC is doing as well as it is right now is an example of what Ngaire was talking about, you know, learning, consolidating lessons and building institutions so that the next crisis isn't as bad as the previous crisis. That level of success falls short when it is, you know, it's made beholden to the pre-existing assumptions about who has knowledge, who has our best interests at heart, that we're falling into these tropes and these assumptions about where solutions will come from that practice shows us isn't always necessarily the case. So I really do think that for African countries, for Latin American countries, for Asian countries, our medium-term, long-term success comes from decoupling ourselves and sort of getting off this idea that we must always have our interests subservient or secondary to what powerful countries are doing. And I think that the stakes, when we're talking about climate change on this panel, I think the stakes couldn't be higher. We're talking about, I've been thinking a lot about plastic waste recently because it's tied into some other work that I'm doing. And when we look at just this very simple issue, whereby international cooperation could actually solve so many problems, but instead what we're seeing is shifting the burden, as we're talking about on this panel, you know, instead of fixing the problem at national level, at regional level in the West, we are selling our waste to poorer countries and making it their problem without there being that transfer of capacity, without there being that transfer of knowledge. That's the kind of multilateralism that we want to see end. And we want to start thinking, well, as Ngaire said, can you take responsibility for your part of the error, of your part of the problem, sorry, and work in a way that recognizes that other people's survival interest is more important than geopolitical, consolidating your geopolitical position. The reason why vaccines are being hoarded, the reasons why we're being told that we can't get the formulae for producing these vaccines is because of the idea that the geopolitical survival of rich countries is more important than the life or death survival of poor countries. And that's why I would really put this radical idea on the table is, what does inclusive and just multilateralism that isn't centered on the geopolitical survival of rich countries look like? I think that's the urgent question, because the status quo is life or death for so many people. And I just don't necessarily think that the people who have power in the current system understand the risk that way.
That's very eloquently and forcefully put. How to work around the geopolitical sort of predominance of the competition between China and the West. How do we do this? Ngaire, talk of expanding, just to stick within the multilateral sort of system we've got for a moment, talk of expanding the veto-wielding membership of the UN Security Council has been around for decades. Nothing, of course, has happened, because it would require the incumbents to agree to dilute their power. So having, Nigeria or Kenya or whoever, or a rotating African member, ditto for Latin America. Is that part of how you reimagine multilateralism? How do you overcome the geopolitical sort of dominance of bandwidth that Nanjala has just elucidated?
Well, look, I think you've got to start with a shift in mindset. You know, we still live in a world order that that one group of countries feel was theirs, that they forged a set of rules for open market capitalist competition and then encouraged everybody else to play that by their rules. And that system, that international system of rules applied by a number of different institutions, has three huge problems now. And the first is that the very people within those countries, within the United States, within Britain, and within the countries of Europe, don't like those rules anymore. There's a backlash against them. The people wanting to continue to support those rules are being voted out. The second problem is that that system, underpinned by US leadership, the US is no longer willing to lead. And the third problem is that a lot of countries are looking at the way China is resolving problems and saying, which sets of solutions do we want? They see China taking on three big problems: climate, technology monopolies, and inequality. And you've got a Chinese leadership that we might not like the solutions being proposed, but it's taking on those problems, and it's shining a light on the fact that our governments are not and don't seem to even be at the beginning of a solution. So in that world, what will multilateralism look like? Well, I take a slightly more geopolitically anchored view, I think, than Nanjala. I mean, I love your spirit of Bandung, but what I see emerging is the international organizations will keep staggering on, and they'll be useful for some things. I think the IMF's done quite well on COVID with its SDR allocation and such like. And China and the United States and other countries will continue to vie for power within them. But we're also going to see multilateralism emerge in the China bloc and in the US bloc. And we're already seeing that happen, with each side creating their own institutions. That's not a bad thing. If you're a developing country or you're a small country, it does give you a few choices, and it does give you some possibility of negotiating what the rules within your own alliance are. And third, we are going to see more ad hoc cooperation, the kind of not just G20, but back to the old concert of Europe, where great powers will necessarily find that on climate, on terrorism, on territories that are fragile and conflict-ridden, on health sometimes, that they actually have overlapping interests, and they will turn to each other to resolve those interests, even as they continue having conflict on others. So I'm an optimistic realist. I think that multilateralism will continue in those different things, and the trick for all smaller countries in the system is to play those three levels of multilateralism.
Again, a fascinating, thought-provoking answer. We are, I should mention, you know, we are fairly limited for time, and there are questions coming in, and I will move to those in a minute. But let me do, before then, a sort of another round of questions. And Elizabeth, starting with you, I just wanted to get into the specifics at the other end of the geopolitical spectrum, your country, the United States. And we have a Biden administration that says America's back after the turbulence and PTSD of the Trump years. We have, at the same time, an IMF that Ngaire mentioned that says it'll cost $50–60 billion to vaccinate 60% of the world by mid-2022, but Biden isn't yet there. Now, I might be, you know, disproved next week. He is holding an international summit next week to coincide with UNGA on the pandemic, and we might see bigger vaccine pledges. But right now, as it stands, Biden is proposing to spend more on upgrading Amtrak than he is on global vaccines. If with a Democratic and internationalist administration, we're having this much trouble politically in demonstrating the one-worldedness of a pandemic and indeed of global warming, what else needs to happen before America resumes, as we hope, a leadership role?
Well, there's so much to say, both in response to your question and to the remarkable conversation we've had so far. I do want to pick up one point connecting your question and a point Ngaire made. I'm always loath to disagree with the remarkable Ngaire Woods, but I do think that the reason that we had Donald Trump elected to the US presidency was not because Americans rejected international cooperation. We've been doing bipartisan polling for 20 years, remarkably consistent and strong bipartisan support for US engagement in the world, believing the UN has value. The UN actually rates higher as an institution on a bipartisan basis in credibility than the US Congress. Now that may not be saying very much these days, but it's to say, I don't think that's the reason we get the political outcomes we have in the United States. I think there are many different drivers. The international cooperation bit is caught as collateral damage. I would be my argument on that. Now, come to the Biden administration. Look, I think they walked into perhaps the most ferocious domestic and global agenda that I think I can remember in my entire political life in the United States. And that's not to excuse what may or may not be what we want to see from them and we don't quite have from them yet on the international front. But I think the world is well aware of the political convulsions the United States is going through at the moment at the domestic level. So I don't think the right comparison is domestic spending versus international spending. I would look at what they're doing on the international stage and whether it's enough and what it would take for it to be enough. And I actually give them, on balance, reasonably high marks, given the context in which they're starting. I mean, first, they are unapologetic about the value of multilateralism and recognizing, Nanjala, your excellent points, with all of which I basically agree about how that needs to change. Their very first steps were about rejoining everything that had been disregarded by the prior administration. Second, they've done that, I believe, with an effort at humility and a much healthier appreciation of how much many others need to contribute. Now, some of that's about burden sharing, but some of it is actually about appropriate leveling of the playing field and genuinely recognizing that, of course, the United States doesn't have every answer to everything. So there is, I think, a different tone. And third, they are trying a different tack to try to bridge the gap between domestic and international policy. So, this idea of a foreign policy that delivers to the American middle class is core to their philosophy of governing. Foreign policy for any country needs to deliver for its country's citizens. So I think, to me, that's the interesting space to watch. People should absolutely push them to continue to do more where they can do more. And I think we're seeing that with every turn of the wheel. So that would be kind of my report card on where we are now with this administration and what we should continue to press and expect from them. But again, with this very healthy, different appreciation for the fact that they don't have every answer, and we shouldn't expect them to. The last thing I'll just say, Ngaire, I'm sure you're right. We are seeing this increasing division into blocks with different philosophies and different institutions. We've been there before. We had decades of a Cold War that looked exactly the same way. Yes, smaller countries can navigate within that, but I don't think that's an optimal place to be. So I guess I still hold out hope that, and there are very specific ways to think about this, that it will be much more of a, not a two block driven world and not the two track world that the first panel discussed, but something a lot more heterogeneous. It creates different kinds of arenas for non-usual coalitions, different exertions of power, and therefore different and slightly more liberating outcomes.
Thank you. Nanjala, I was going to ask a question. I have several for you, but I just seen an audience question that I'll pose to you. How can advanced countries, and let's just accept the word advanced, I guess more wealthy countries help developing countries industrialize without endangering our planet further? This is a common question. You can dispute the premise if you wish.
That's an interesting question. And I think I would answer it in two parts. The first part is, I would say we need to interrogate our idea of what it means to industrialize and what it means to develop. I think that there's been a lot of optimism, for example, about Green New Deals and sort of accelerating past the ugly middle where you kind of had a reliance on coal and a reliance on fossil fuel and going straight into green economies that are predicated on alternative sources of energy, thinking differently about waste, thinking about plastic, thinking differently about the raw materials that made rich countries' industrialization possible. So I think the first part begins with that. Do we have to rethink entirely what our ideas of industrialization are, so that our metrics are different, our interests are different. It's not growth, 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 consume, 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 but is actually inclusive, just, fair economies that present opportunities for people who want them and for people who need them. And the second part, I think, is partly tied to the overarching question that we have right now, which is, how do we move away from a world that is organized such that poor countries are seen primarily as sources of raw material, and not places where people live, and not places where people have families and hopes and dreams and all of the things that I think people in rich countries just maybe don't see in the policy making, in the decision making. I think that especially from the vantage point of an African country, being in service of the foreign policy ideas or aspirations of rich countries often means that our social aspirations, our political aspirations disappear in the conversation. So we're looking at Ethiopia right now and the crisis that's happening in Ethiopia right now. And the only way we can get the kind of attention that that crisis deserves is to focus on what Ethiopia represents to either China or the United States militarily, and not the fact that millions of people have been killed and have been, their lives have been disrupted by this conflict and crisis. And so I think the second part to that is, again, we're reframing, and this goes, I think, to what Elizabeth was saying. We have to go back to the basics of why we're doing all of this stuff. Why did we build multilateral institutions? Why did we build, the system? There was something that we were trying to get at. There was ideas that we were trying to entrench, and I think it's that part often gets lost, and I think it's important to come back to it. So the basic idea of wanting the interests of people, of societies in poor countries to be as well represented as the economic opportunities and the political opportunities that they represent in foreign policy discourse will get us closer to a new way of thinking about industrialization. I'm never going to be one person to say, growth, 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 mine all the things, burn all the things, make all the plastics, use up all the fossil fuels, because I think the way that the world has done that in the last 50, 100 years, we're living with the consequences right now. Not everybody can consume oil, or not every country should be encouraged to consume the way that rich countries have consumed in the last 50 years.
I'm afraid this is going to have to be the final question, Mary, because time has run out. We focused on, the reimagining multilateralism, the Bandung option as well, and the heterogeneous approach, all of which are very interesting. And we're looking forward to the development further of the common agenda. But just to sort of pick a slightly different strand to end on, if there's been a silver lining to the last 18 months, it's the speed with which vaccines have been developed, not distributed around the world, but developed. That took a lot of us by surprise, including the scientific community. Is there an Operation Warp Speed that humanity can jointly produce for climate change?
Oh, wow. Terrific question. There has to be. I mean, I think the note I would end on is to say that you've got to start with the aspiration. When JFK said we're going to make it to the moon, he didn't say, let's see if we can make it quarter of the way and then turn around and come back. He said, let's see if we can make it to the moon. Likewise with vaccinations, the team at Oxford said, let's try and do the impossible. And instead of taking 10 years, let's see if we can do it in 3 months, 6 months. We've now got to do that with vaccinating the world. And on climate change, there really are so many different technologies that are underway right now, whether it's green steel, or green cement, or green aluminium, that if humans come together and set their aspiration to reach the moon, metaphorically, on climate change, they will achieve. So I think I'd go to there and say, if there's one thing the COVID vaccination taught us, it's that When humans set their aspiration incredibly high, it makes impossible things possible.
Well, that is a suitably and I guess good antidote to a lot of the gloom that surrounds us, and a good note on which to end. But sadly, prematurely, this could go on a lot longer. Thank you so much, Elizabeth, Nanjala, and Ngaire, for some really wonderful and interesting remarks that have given me a lot of food for thought. Thanks so much.